Alright, you guys, so after a lot of early round turmoil, one way or the other, the usual suspects have found their way to the Wimbledon semifinals. Again, my apologies, my procrastinating ass has made this so I want to be brief here. I want to go to bed and not feel like crap when I wake up tomorrow for these semifinals. I don't know what ability I have to do that, but let's just cut to the chase. Got a lot of quarterfinalists wrong this Wimbledon for obvious reasons, but as we arrive at this final weekend, these are my predicted semifinals. Obviously, we have the three guys that we expected to be here, albeit particularly in the case of Alcaraz's early rounds and Jannik Sinner going through some unforeseen, winding turns in their march to the semifinals, especially as opposed to their Roland Garros run-ups, where these three also made the semifinals there. These remain the three guys that are a level above the rest. Obviously, in Djokovic's case, that remains only in the slams, the only venues where he really seems to care still, and for good reason. His resume speaks for itself, but in a unique way, despite, I think, none of those three looking as convincing as they did, say, in the run-up to the semifinals at Roland Garros a couple weeks ago. Doesn't mean I think that they'll be any less equipped to go foot to gas down the stretch in this tournament. And then, of course, Taylor Fritz, a guy that probably could have made it here as early as 2022, so it felt a little bit overdue for him to get in that final weekend push at Wimbledon. Think this is best case for our last couple matches, these championships. These are, currently the four best players on grass. I think that's very clear to say. Let's start with the early semifinal, Alcaraz Fritz. I don't think there's that much, suspense here in saying that we all expect Alcaraz to go forward, make this final. Don't really entertain a world where, he is the loser of this match. I think over the course of his tournament, there have been signs that maybe sooner than later, the wear and tear of this run since early April, of making every final, only losing one time, obviously continuing on a career best win streak. I feel like the signs of, those matches adding up are there. I think I saw on Punto de Break that he felt a little bit of discomfort in the shoulder before the Rublev match, though he said it was only the morning of and felt fine during the match, and I think definitely put to rest with easily his most convincing performance in the quarterfinals against Cam Norrie, who, to this point, he surprisingly enough hadn't had, a match this lopsided against. And to me, for this tournament in particular, I think that match was exactly what the doctor ordered. Really routine, never in doubt. Very efficient Alcaraz performance, made that much more important by the fact that, being the bottom half, playing day one, he gets 2 days off now ahead of the semifinals. And in the two matches that Carlos has played Taylor Fritz, they've been very lopsided. He seemed very comfortable both in Miami and the Laver Cup, winning in relatively straightforward fashion in both. Think back, to a Taylor Fritz quote, I think at the end of last year, when assessing his most difficult matchups, he rated Carlos as by far the biggest nightmare matchup for him, said as opposed to Sinner, who in his own way has, of course, handled Fritz relatively straightforward as well, but Taylor saying, at least in those matches, it felt like, he could impose himself. It felt like he could play his tennis, whereas, calling back on that Alcaraz match against him at Laver Cup, where, last year's Laver Cup, Carlos did not put a foot wrong, probably the best indoor tennis of his career by a long shot. He just felt powerless, and I don't think that's a matter of, Alcaraz on that particular given day, or both the days that he's played Fritz, being in terrific form and just having one of those days. I do genuinely think that in between the lines, there's a lot to point to for why not only does Taylor feel blunted, but Alcaraz himself also probably feels a great deal of freedom and clarity in how to play this guy. And yeah, I mean, it really is as simple as, there is a real gulf here in their athletic abilities. And that's the only real department that Fritz just innately can't change. I think to his credit, as opposed to most of his other 90s gen contemporaries, Taylor Fritz has improved a lot. A lot. I mean, you saw it with the returning first two rounds of this tournament. Willing to make these ever so slight but effective changes with the bunt return, standing up closer to the baseline to return big serves. I think now, as opposed to maybe 2-3 years ago, definitely an established great server, whereas in the past it seemed like more of, a great server in theory. The idea of it, made more sense than in actual execution, but now he's actually there, and I really can respect that, especially when a lot of his contemporaries have stagnated, if not to this point regressed. But the one thing I think there's no fixing is, as a mover, as an athlete, he is what he is. And while his only real look at making a match out of this, giving himself a chance to win, is, hoping Alcaraz comes out nervous as he did the last semifinal he played against Musetti, working from there, keeping him under pressure by, effectively playing just real big, booming tennis. Gotta have a great serving day, obviously. He served great the entirety of this tournament. And yeah, really tried to redline as like Alechka did in the final of Queens. Obviously, there's probably an hourglass on, how long you can sustain that. Probably results in, lesser margins for Fritz than he's used to. Because as a baseliner, he hits huge off both wings, but for the most part, there is a great deal of safety there for him. And yeah, playing that way, the two matches against Alcaraz, clearly has not worked, because on the flip side, the weight of his ball just isn't troubling, on any surface, but this surface now in particular, the best mover on this surface, a guy that can hit as big as Fritz, if not bigger, but perhaps even more crucially, all the options available to him, the variety on this surface, the drop shots just seem to die and take it the best out of any surface. He can use his slice, defense, neutral, offense, whatever the case may be, put Fritz into very uncomfortable positions and have to, bend low, hit balls off his shoelaces, and then work from there once, he's at neutral, because there's just so much weaponry at his disposal that, yeah, being neutral with Carlos Alcaraz, you're not going to be in neutral for very long. On top of that, these last two matches, the improved serve from Queens seems to finally have made its way over to Wimbledon. Obviously, grass giving a boost to everybody on serve, but even so, kind of ominous level of serving from Alcaraz the last two matches. If he can pair that with like any semblance of, an A-level baseline game, he's going to win this title. And of course, him being the much superior athlete as well, I think he is now the best first serve returner on tour. I made a habit of hammering, how many just makeable second serve returns Alcaraz seems to just not put into play. But, the way things are sped up on grass, honestly, I think a lot of the decision-making stuff is just a whole lot more natural, instinctive for Alcaraz. Even Fritz serving his best, I would anticipate a lot more returns are going to be coming back than anybody that he's faced to this point. And I really don't anticipate Taylor being able to take more than a set. I feel like it's going to be one of those matches, I will say, Alcaraz, that's like a pretty routine for. I think Alcaraz will blink somewhere here. But overall, pretty unbothered. This is a good matchup. His game is trending upwards. Crucially, now heading to the back end of this event, he should be well rested. And obviously, his reputation, his track record in the back end of these big events is sparkling. I like Alcaraz in 4. On to Jannik Sinner, Novak Djokovic second semifinal, a rematch just a couple of weeks after they played at Roland Garros. A match that continued the recent trend in their head-to-head of Jannik really turning the tables on Novak here. Winner of 5 of the last 6, winner of 4 in a row. And I guess I'll start with both these guys with some question marks physically coming in. Obviously, Jannik Sinner, probably the biggest talking point of his tournament to this point, because otherwise it's been blowout city, was that 4th round where Grigor Dimitrov seemed to really have him on the ropes. And as a sidebar, I do really want to say this feels like such a gut punch because it feels, oddly reminiscent to a Juan Martín del Potro. Both guys, Grigor, Delpo, unanimously loved among their colleagues, among tennis fans of, all backgrounds. Tremendous talents, tremendous personalities, making it all the more cruel for Grigor, who has, I think in this phase, the last 2 years, become his most consistent self, yet really since the dawn of the 2020s, it seems the body has been giving him diminished returns to the point where over the last year, of course, you've heard it everywhere, he's now retired from his last 4 or 5 majors. 5 majors, make that, to where he can't even finish the tournament in one piece. Brutal stuff. And I will say, as far as Sinner is concerned, I think it's fair to say, that you could say he could feel a bit lucky to still be in this tournament. And I don't say that lightly. I think under normal circumstances, if you spot Dimitrov a 2-set lead over Sinner, I would probably say it's a coin flip, if not slight advantage Sinner, for me to say that he could have pulled the comeback. But watching that match, these were not normal circumstances. This was as errant and poor of timing I've seen from Sinner off the ground, probably since 2021, honestly. Because ever since then, he hasn't always been the well-oiled machine he's become in a lot of the other parts of the game, but, since then you could say the ground game has been a constant just 1%er among 1%ers. And I do think, there's definitely, a lot of reason to say that the elbow was causing him problems. The MPH on the forehand being down. I can't tell the extent to it. Certainly the Dimitrov slice, staying so low on grass, forcing Sinner to hit up, made it harder to inject pace, and it was very effective. And I think before anything, it really was, how huge Grigor was hitting the serve, and Sinner just couldn't get a read on it for most of the first 2 sets. And if that persisted, certainly he was going to have a hard time coming back, because on that particular day, it just did not seem like Jannik was going to be able to access his best level, at least not for another set or so. Of course, don't think he was drawing dead. You also got to look at Dimitrov's track record. I know it hurts to put that into perspective against these top guys. And I think the ultimate tell is you look at the second serve points in this match, where you would think these guys would be in neutral, and Dimitrov was, trading in the percentage for pace on his serve. Sinner was getting a fair share of looks at second serves, and Grigor was at 50% on his second serve points won, and that was serving 58% of first serves in through a little under 2.5 sets. And Jannik was under 50% at 44% of his second serve points won. And regardless of surface, you just do not see that. So for whatever reason, whatever extent the elbow was bothering him, certainly abnormal for Sinner performing the way he did, the type of misses we were seeing off the ground. Even once we got into extended rallies, the few times that we did where it would be big advantage Sinner, it just wasn't for that reason. But yeah, fate was really, really cruel to Dimitrov here that we didn't get to find out. But ultimately, Jannik's next match, Ben Shelton, for the most part, aside from maybe just by sheer pace of Ben's serve a certain times, I felt like maybe the shock, the vibrations, hitting the returns off those serves maybe made Sinner wince a couple of times. Gil Gross also pointing out, when it wasn't in the pocket, when it was closer to his body, when the elbow had to bend. I thought that was a really good point. That maybe that's where that arm will be tested most or feel the most discomfort. But other than that, that match seemed to show that it is manageable enough pain for him that he can still operate somewhere near his best. And then, of course, with Novak Djokovic, it was 1 point away from the match. I think the third to last point of the match. He took a nasty slip in press, I believe he said, the entirety of the fourth set. He was feeling a bit of muscle tightness, which was exacerbated after the fall. Obviously, today, cancels practice. Could potentially just be precautionary. Certainly, given the opportunity and his age, can never be too careful with that. He's been there, done that. He can navigate it again if the pain is manageable, but certainly things to keep an eye out on that front for both health-wise. The game plan for both seems pretty clear-cut. Jannik, I doubt there's really much to change. The dynamic recently really just has honestly seemed as clear-cut as just youth, where this version of Djokovic can't really bank on lockdown mode. And why is that? I'm a be lame and borrow tennis Twitter's, Novak's son term, but that is what Jannik Sinner is in tennis terms. He has his own lockdown mode, but it's just bigger. And this version of Djokovic does not have the wheels, the legs, to be able to give it as stern a test as he once could. And that's something that I really overlooked heading into their Roland Garros match. Very quickly, within a set, Novak kind of identified a need to redline. It made for a match where I thought he gave the very best that he could, but in the process, a match where the unforced error tally was super, super high, for Djokovic in that match. And on paper, the grass should help with, just how big, just how, out of his comfort zone Novak feels like he has to go. I think, obviously, there's a need to be on the front foot here. And at 38 years old, that grass court will supplement a lot of the tools that he has developed or already were at his disposal that he can play into, particularly, of course, the serve, which, he's been serving great all tournament. That will have to continue. On paper, shouldn't look like he's pressing as much as it did with him at Roland Garros and the slow nighttime clay. Should get more juice out of the +1. Again, like Dimitrov, use a lot of his variety for a bigger guy, get him down into uncomfortable positions more easily, even if I wouldn't say Novak has a slice as good as Grigor's. Still a pretty good slice, I think, at this point in his career. He's made it pretty good. The last 2-3 years or so becoming the most willing volleyer he's been, coming to net as much as he ever has. All of that, he will need. Because it honestly is a lot more complicated for him than it is for Sinner. For Sinner, it literally is, if I get in the spot that Alex de Minaur was able to get Novak in a decent amount in their fourth round match, where de Minaur was, able to get the upper hand in a lot of those points he was able to get his teeth in, and that weren't just sort of bang bang. Sinner gets him in those spots, he'll be in really good shape. Because, yeah, just the way this court bounces, the way this court plays, even if it feels slower than the tune-up grass events, it still plays enough to where that Sinner rally ball is just going to feel all the more heavy and even harder to make up ground on. But, above all that, and I think a lot of the court stuff would lead you to believe, again, that there's a lot more helping Novak here to give Sinner a real match, which I do think he will. I will continue to have my eye on the Djokovic return against the Sinner serve, because that has really been disastrous for Novak for a year and a half now that they've played, albeit that's like 3 meetings. Aussie Open last year, Shanghai last year, where he created no break points. Obviously the French Open, he was able to break the one time, but not any more encouraging considering, it's clay. You would think at least he would have been able to create more opportunities, and I get that he had the chances to win the third set. But considering Sinner was barely over 50% first serves in that match, it just wasn't good enough. It still signifies a trend where, Djokovic still hasn't either figured out the difficulties he's having with Sinner's serve or been able to just overcome his decline as a returner, probably a combination of both. But on a surface here where, again, everybody is given a boost on their serve, I'm interested to see how that plays out. I feel like that in particular is part and parcel to just eye test how it's looked that Djokovic is playing catch-up throughout running in quicksand, seemingly. One of the great problem solvers in our game, I am interested to seeing, what, if any, counter there is for that. I will pick Sinner in a very tight 4, on the other hand. Both my predictions are the victor in 4. I think very different feels to both matches. I think this is one where we could see multiple tie breaks. I am tempted to say 5, but honestly, if it goes 5, I low-key would pick Djokovic. I do think that for old Big 3, it's a little bit overstated, the gas tank part, and I understand they were all at different points in their 30s, and the gas tank parameters have sort of shifted since these matches, but I still think it kind of applies, where, for lack of a better term, aura sort of kicks in. I've seen it multiple times. It just seems like they grasp the opportunity at hand and are just able to manage the fatigue and get a little bit of an adrenaline boost as a result of the moment. I saw Nadal dead on his feet earlier in the 2022 AO final, and then boom, we got to the 5th set, and 36-year-old Rafa looked fresher than Medvedev. For Djokovic himself, it's happened, the AO 20 final, the RG 21 final, and on top of that, I don't know how Sinner would respond. I would be very interested to see Sinner, whenever it happens, but first time in a super high leverage, high pressure situation since the RG final, if that scar tissue is, at play and it affects how he executes in the clutch at all. But yeah, I feel like there's pathways to victory for both here. Might be an even more important match for Novak. Obviously at his age and the venue, probably being best suited to where he can win big again. And of course to, give his best shot to stem the tide in this head-to-head again. And given his history, you would certainly expect him to put his best foot forward tomorrow. Be a real handful to deal with. But yeah, at this point, I'm just making my pick here. Based on Sinner, I think still having a decided advantage in still probably the most prominent fixture in both of their games, that being their ground games, and in those baseline exchanges, I feel like he's still gonna make Novak execute on a handful of low percentage choices, and while this court gives him the best shot to be able to execute those the most consistently, I think the percentages still stand in Jannik's favor, especially, until Novak shows he can get a better hold on the Sinner serve on his return. So yeah, again, I will call for a 4-setter that is won on very thin margins for Jannik Sinner. Think by a smidge youth prevails again, but super excited for tomorrow, particularly this latter semifinal. Promises to be an absolute banger finish to these championships, and may the best man win.